Salud amigos, buenas noches.
Greetings, friends. Good evening. Extremely strong images of what happened this afternoon in Moscow. I believe you are all informed, all aware of what happened. A commando group of between 5 and 8 people entered that festival, that concert hall, where a lot of people had already gathered, with handguns, all apparently Kalashnikov assault rifles. They entered and began to shoot indiscriminately, as seen in that image, and threw incendiary bombs and grenades. The initial assessments spoke of something like 40. Now, from what I've seen in the last few minutes, and apologies for the delay, also due to the search for information, the Russian military intelligence service speaks of close to 60 dead and more than 120 injured. All this is hot information, and we need to process it very calmly. In any case, I want to mention a problem with the air here. It's very hot here, especially because of the lights and the studio that is operating. What it seems to indicate is that these assailants, from what has been seen in these images and others, I have received many images, all very domestic, by how these people moved and how they carried their weapons and so on. They were evidently not improvising. By how they moved in groups, how they looked at each other. In short, many analysts were already making some studies.
Ya vertiendo algunos estudios.
Those of us who have seen what happened over the last 15 years, especially in Syria, and look why I bring it up, the case of Syria, this is very similar. Highly trained groups. These are military. There's no doubt they are military. Not people who just thought of protesting against Putin or whoever, and consequently carry out this massacre. These people are trained military by how they move, how they attack, and the cold-blooded manner in which they do it. It must not be very easy, quite the opposite actually, to commit these kinds of attacks and be able to move forward and even escape, because apparently they escaped, they would have captured 1 or 2 already.
Habrían apresado a 1 o a 2 ya. Bueno, vamos por partes.
Well, let's take this one step at a time. It's horrible. It's horrible. So our condolences there to the Russian brothers who for some time now have been suffering various types of attacks on their territory, not only in the Belgorod region there on the border with Ukraine. Remember last year, a little more than a year ago, a young philosopher, the daughter of the important philosopher Alexander Dugin, was murdered with a car bomb. She is Dugina, with a car bomb. A girl of, I believe, 29 years old who was a philosopher. She was not military, nor did she instigate, nor call for any type of attacks, nothing of the sort. A philosopher, but the daughter of an important philosopher within Russia.
Nada que ver, filósofa, pero hija de un filósofo importante dentro de Rusia. La asesinaron en un coche bomba.
She was killed with a car bomb. After that, a lot of drones have fallen, especially in different parts of Russian territory, there in Moscow itself. A while ago, I was live with friends from the Spanish business channel, NegociosTelevisión, NegociosTV, or NegociosTV, and I said something. I said it very quickly, then I kept thinking about what I said. Perhaps many of you, some have already mentioned it to me, saw it, heard it. I said, in war, everything goes. Because that's really how it is. I understand that this deeply hurts the Russians. But well, in war, everything goes. Each side does what it thinks it has to do.
Cada parte hace lo que piensa que tiene que hacer. Y en este caso,
and in this case, what the people of Zelensky, Ukraine, did with the help of the British and American intelligence services, I believe there is no doubt, or there cannot be any doubts. We will analyze it in detail later. What this is about, I believe, is that the Kremlin, the Russian leaders, I don't say Putin, because everyone says Putin as if he were the only one making decisions there, as if he were a king. And that's not the case. It has nothing to do with reality. There are many people who think, who have opinions, and there are political, strategic contradictions, different conceptions.
Políticas, estratégicas, diferentes concepciones. Pero lo que importaría en estos momentos sería que...
But what would matter at this moment is that the Russian leadership, those who do have decision-making capacity, do not get carried away by this provocation, because this is a provocation. Directed, organized, orchestrated, and financed by the West, by Britain's MI6, the CIA, NATO, in short. And now we're going to analyze it. We will take a little while, I hope not too much, and we will analyze it. In any case, these are the conditions of the war to which, look how curious, the Russian people have been subjected for many decades, I would dare to say centuries, by all kinds of invasions, provocations, attacks, and there they are always in the fight.
Y allí está, siempre en la pelea. Y sin embargo, en Occidente siempre se dice...
And yet in the West it is always said to be the fault of the Russians. It was Napoleon back in 1800 who crossed all of Europe, crossed all of this, Ukraine, Belarus, and the rest, reached Moscow, settled in Moscow, and could not definitively dominate, subdue the Russian Empire, and had to retreat under horrendous conditions, to return with his army in pieces, more than half dead during that retreat. But before that, the Swedes, the Vikings, if you will, the Mongols had tried to dominate that Russia. And then also there, in the year 1942, Hitler himself in Operation Barbarossa, well, all that about going to invade Russia and reaching Stalingrad and then having to retreat.
Y después tener que retroceder.
Throughout those times, Russia did not invade anyone, And some will say, well, but the countries of the Soviet bloc, well, what Russia did, but not only Russia, the soldiers from all those countries who joined the Red Army, the Communist Red Army, were the ones who reached Berlin to Hitler's house, which was in a shelter below in a bunker. There's the famous movie, there's several movies about that. They got there. In that coming and going of Germans who went and came back, and the Russian counteroffensive, Russia, the communists, lost 25 million people. And yet today, the propaganda of the Anglo-Zionists continues to say that the Russians are the bad ones.
Sigue diciendo que los rusos son los malos. Sigue diciendo que los rusos son los malos.
He keeps saying that the Russians are the bad guys. And what's surprising here is that the official discourse of Western propaganda still insists that those who saved Europe were the Americans. Hollywood movies tell you that. And I said it a while ago, and I'll repeat it very quickly. If Russia lost 25 million people, 25, it's easy to say, isn't it? 25 million. The United States in total, during the whole war, deployed a total of 180,000 soldiers on European soil, of whom 80,000 died. 25 million on one side, 80,000 on the other. I think, and one reached Berlin and Hitler's house, and the other was in Italy, in agreement with the mafia and others.
A la casa de Hitler y el otro andaba por Italia en acuerdo con la mafia y demás.
And yet they still tell the tale that it was the United States. But let's return to today's topic. This horrible, treacherous attack, we just saw the images. I won't show them again because they are very strong. It began to raise all kinds of speculation in the hours following its occurrence, because nobody was saying anything, nobody was claiming it. In the midst of this, I was cordially invited by the friends at NegociosTV in the middle of the afternoon, about an hour and a half after all this, and seeing these images along with others we had available, I ventured the idea that this was a jihadist group.
Yo dije, aventuré la idea de que esto era un grupo yihadista. Por cómo se movían, etc.
Based on how they were moving, etc., I ventured that idea.
Desde Washington.
While from Washington, it was hinted through press agencies, which I was receiving and we all were receiving, that this, and on television, even on Argentine television, I saw an Argentine journalist, an Argentine commentator, saying that they were letting the hypothesis float because, of course, this is the way these people have to manipulate you and the public opinion by letting doubt linger. Could it have been a self-attack by the Russian authorities, by Putin in particular?
Un autoatentado de las autoridades rusas, de Putin en particular, e incluso invitaban a una periodista.
And they even invited a journalist who was evidently of Slavic origin. She spoke Spanish, but with a heavy Russian accent, so to speak, who said that Russia had invaded Ukraine, and how unfair that was, how wrong it was, how good Zelensky was, and how right the Ukrainian Nazis were to defend themselves. That was the scheme. And this journalist, along with the Argentine journalist, were actually two Argentine television channels, which surprised me a lot. They said that they were advancing the idea that it had been Putin who had staged a false flag operation. They always say Putin because it's easier to say crazy Putin and so on, a way to manipulate as well. And what could he do? In turn, the State Department, actually the Pentagon, said that they certified that it had not been Ukraine, that they hadn't either. And from there, all the Anglo-Saxon propaganda and mind manipulation factories began to operate, as we must say. We must call things by their name, which claimed that indeed this gave the impression that it had been a false flag operation carried out by Putin. When I appeared on NegociosTV, I said, for me, this is a jihadist group acting here as it did in different military operations. They were identical. They're in Damascus, in Syria, in Homs, and in different parts of Syria, when an attempt was made to create a color revolution, an internal revolution, to overthrow the president of Syria, because Syria and its president bother Israel. They are very critical of Israel.
Son muy críticos con Israel. Entonces, Israel pidió que se derrocara a ese gobierno.
So Israel asked for that government to be overthrown, as well as those of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Those are all requests from Israel, which incites, instigates, but then asks others to get involved in the war, right? Always the United States. But anyway, back to the case. And then I had several movements of calls, messages, and so on, in which I was criticized for having ventured this idea that it was because of ISIS. Well, now it has been, at least it has been recognized. Here it is, I just saw it a while ago in Le Monde newspaper, where ISIS, the Islamic State, let's put it here, acknowledges, this is the front page of the newspaper Le Monde, and here it says, claimed by the Islamic State. Sorry, it's in French, but I think it's understandable.
Reivindicado por el Estado Islámico. Perdón, está en francés, pero creo que se entiende. Reivindicado por la organización Estado Islámico.
Claimed by the Islamic State organization. And here it says, the Islamic State claims the attack in Moscow. Well, up to this point, we're going to tell the truth. I'm not a genius at this either. I made a fairly simple reasoning, which is what I'm going to share with you. That this was not a self-inflicted attack by Russia is obvious. What interest could Russia, Moscow, the Kremlin, or Putin have in staging a self-attack? According to what I heard from these two geniuses of Argentine journalism and several French people on French television, they say that with this, what Putin was going to do was provoke a feeling of anger, hatred, a spirit of revenge in the Russian population to increase pressure on Ukraine.
Para aumentar la presión sobre Ucrania. Ahora, yo creo que no hay que ser muy genio.
Now, I believe that one doesn't have to be a genius. One must look at the facts. If Putin won the elections a week ago with 87% of the votes, what kind of unity does he want around himself? Macron, who has his popularity at 13 points, doesn't need this. Or Biden, who doesn't even reach 20 and has elections in 8 months. These are puppets. Or Pedrito Sanchez, whom nobody believes what he says. Or Ursula von der Leyen there in the European Union. Or Borrell or Scholz in Germany. Those are the ones who need a spirit of war and nationalism to get ahead, to redeem themselves a bit. Putin won with 87% of the votes.
Para reivindicarse un poco. Putin ganó con el 87% de los votos. Y después, claro, también escuché.
And then, of course, I also heard the Argentine journalist badly, that Argentine journalist on a major cable channel, saying that this was the case, that Putin had won with 87% in a country where there is no freedom of opinion, no freedom of the press, and there are threats to political parties and political leaders. Obviously, that is a falsehood. That is manipulating public opinion, because that is not true, that is not correct. Putin had 3 opponents, but despite that, I am going to use the argument that was put on the table 2 or 3 days ago by Juan Antonio Aguilar, a great Spanish analyst, who made a very simple reasoning. But what if abroad, in the Russian embassies around the world, Russian citizens could also vote?
De Rusia en el mundo también podían votar los ciudadanos rusos. Y votaron fuera del territorio ruso
and 800,000 Russians voted outside Russian territory. And Putin won with the same percentage, I think a little less. He said it might have been 85%, 80%. So, whom did those citizens in Argentina, in France, in the United States, in the Netherlands, where the Russians live, threaten? Who threatened them? So this idea that it was a self-inflicted attack is the same reaction that these Western propaganda agencies, Protan, had when that pipeline exploded in the sea, the Baltic Sea, which was the worst industrial attack, industrial sabotage in history, due to its magnitude, due to the cost it entailed. It was a pipeline that had cost $5,000 million. It was rendered useless. $5,000 million. And the first thing they said was that the Russians sabotaged themselves because the gas pipeline was theirs. People said, but what interest could Russia have in committing that attack? Well, that's the same thing those agencies said. That was the same thing those journalists I saw today on Argentine television said, saying it could have been self-sabotage. And they've already set the stage because, of course, they don't dare to say it was Putin. They introduce it as a topic, and it wasn't. And this Slavic correspondent said on air that it was very likely to have been self-sabotage. So then the person, the viewer, somewhat incredulous, not well informed, walks away with the idea that it was a Russian self-sabotage. It was not a Russian self-sabotage.
No fue un autoatentado ruso. Fue el ISIS, lo acaba de reconocer.
It was ISIS. They just acknowledged it. It's public, but it's not too important. We need to go to the genesis, the origin. Who is ISIS? What is ISIS? Where did it come from? Who are the people of ISIS? The people of ISIS, you'll remember, about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, was a group that was the Islamic State, ISIS, which had become strong within Syria, fighting against the president of Syria and the government of Syria, which was a socialist government, with a more open vision, not theocratic, that inspired in that region of Western Asia or the Middle East, as it is said, a more tolerant, more open, more progressive, more leftist vision, if you will. And that was bothersome, especially to Israel.
Y eso molestaba sobre todo a Israel. Entonces, ¿qué hicieron?
So what did they do? This group from the Islamic State appeared, claiming they wanted to establish a caliphate. Do you remember how they committed horrible crimes against local populations? Anyway, well, later it was known because in the end everything is known, and especially what comes from the Anglo-Saxon world, everything is always known. And those of us who dedicate ourselves to this, we sense it, and then we end up going to the sources that confirm what was our intuition. ISIS, that famous Islamic State that wanted to create a caliphate, had as commanders, as leaders, all former commanders of the Iraqi army who had been taken prisoners. Listen well to what I'm telling you, because this way it's clear and we don't have to repeat it.
Así queda claro y no lo tenemos que volver a repetir. Eran todos comandantes, altos comandantes.
They were all commanders, high-ranking commanders, and mid-level commanders of the Iraqi army from the time of Saddam Hussein, who had been captured by the American army during the invasion of Iraq 2003, 2004, 2005. They killed almost all of them, but some remained alive and were imprisoned. They were taken to one of these secret prisons that no one knows what was done to them or why they were there. Well, we do know, and that's why Julian Assange is still in prison. He has been subjected to the worst tortures for having revealed what the CIA and the American security agencies were doing to the Iraqis. But well, these high-ranking Iraqi commanders were imprisoned in the Mosul prison. There in Iraq.
En la prisión de Mosul, allí en Irak. And
through a mechanism of seduction that has to do with money, because the movies you see on Hollywood television and the Hollywood and television series, which tell you that the United States, with its technology and its satellites and its identification systems and its super sophisticated technology, unravel terrorist cells Discover and Conduct Research, or that Israeli series, Fauda, what was it called, in which they investigated and managed to identify their enemies. All of that is pure propaganda. The only two ways these security agencies, the CIA, Mossad, MI6, that operate in that whole region have are two ways.
El Mossad, el MI6, que operan en toda esa región, son dos formas. Lo hacen, logran sus objetivos, o
They
logran
do it,
identificar.
they achieve their objectives or manage to identify those they want to eliminate or cells they want to eliminate through two ways. One is with money. They have endless money, so they seduce with money, even Palestinians, fighters, guerrillas. Many turn around, they sell out, they sell themselves for money. For example, that Russian pilot who recently met, let's say, the end of his life, to put it in a way that social media won't sanction me. There in Spain, a Russian pilot, helicopter pilot, young man of 25, 30 years, 25, 28 years, who about a year ago was highlighted with his crew in his helicopter to fight there in Ukraine.
Y a su tripulación en su helicóptero para pelear allí en Ucrania. Él en un determinado momento
At a certain moment, the pilot killed his two Russian companions, killed them in the aircraft, and surrendered with his helicopter to the Ukrainians. Well, a couple of weeks ago, he met his end. There he was in Spain, hidden. They had changed his identification. They had given him a new identity. And why did he do it? Let's see. Out of conviction, they made it seem like he was convinced that he criticized Russia and Putin. No, they paid him $500,000 for $500,000. $500,000. Acknowledge, this is in the press. There's not much to investigate. Well, this is the oldest mechanism, to buy. They say that a certain Judas, after the Last Supper, I think it was 30 coins, right?
Allí después de la última cena creo que fueron 13 monedas, ¿no? Ahí me recordará, 13 monedas fueron.
There they will remember me, 30 coins it was, for money. And the other mechanism is those who do not sell out, who do not surrender, who do not turn around, to subject them to a series of, how to say it so that social media, and you understand me, and social media does not get angry with me, to subject those people to a somewhat aggressive physical treatment, you know what I'm referring to, until the person falls exhausted from the pain, the suffering, etc., etc. There is no other way. All that about technology and that they see everything. Be careful they see everything, and be careful they know everything, and they are going to identify you and track you. Guys, that's from the movies. It doesn't exist like that.
Muchachos, eso es de las películas. Eso no existe así. ¿Que tienen mecanismos? Claro que sí. ¿Que tienen?
Do they have mechanisms?
Sí, claro que sí.
Of course they do. Do they have possibilities? Yes, of course. But believe me, I worked there inside. I can assure you that a lot of it is myth. A lot of it is myth. Of course they have technology, but to identify someone and then strike them with a drone, someone needs to tell them where they are and tell them where that person who needs to be eliminated is, and place a tracker and a GPS and other technologies that exist. But let's not be afraid of them. I say all this so that we won't be afraid of them, nor believe what they show on TV series, which one watches and says, how can they be lying to people like that? Do they have technology?
¿Que tienen tecnología? Sí, claro que sí, claro que sí. Pero los mecanismos son siempre los.
Yes, of course. But the mechanisms are always the same. There are two, money and a somewhat friendly physical treatment. Let's put it that way. And since they have plenty of money, especially in dollars and in British pounds, but especially dollars, their capabilities are enormous. So there, in the city of Mosul, in that prison, there were a few high-ranking commanders of the army, of the former army of Iraq, of Saddam Hussein, who through the mechanism of money, it's not known how much, agreed to organize ISIS. They agreed to organize ISIS. That is, to lead an organization set up from A to Z by the CIA. Invented. They invent and direct and do the press, do the advertising, do the propaganda. That's why there's a topic that at some point will need to be discussed, which is a controversial issue.
Por eso hay un tema que en algún momento va a haber que conversarlo, que es un tema polémico,